My wife used to say I was invisible. Not in those exact words. She was too careful for that. But I heard it in the way she'd answer for me at dinner parties before I could open my mouth. In the way she'd laugh a little too quickly when someone asked what I did for work. "He's in tech," she'd say, waving her hand like she was swatting a fly, as if the 17 years I'd spent building systems that ran quietly beneath everything, beneath hospitals, logistics networks, financial platforms, were just background noise. I never corrected her. That was my flaw, I suppose. I let it go every time. My name is Leonard. I'm 51 years old. I spent the better part of 2 decades building proprietary data routing software out of a home office that used to be a spare bedroom. I didn't have investors. I didn't have a team. I had a whiteboard, 3 monitors, and a problem I couldn't stop thinking about. The kind of quiet obsession that doesn't look like ambition from the outside. It just looks like a man who spends too much time alone. My wife's name is Susan. We'd been married 23 years when this happened. We had 2 children. Our son Garrett, who was 26 and worked as a mid-level operations manager at a tech firm downtown, and our daughter Meredith, 24, who had just finished her MBA and was doing well for herself at a consulting group. I was proud of both of them. Still am, I think, even now. Susan had been VP of Strategic Partnerships at a company called Tech Solutions for 6 years. It was a growing firm, data infrastructure mostly. Her boss was a man named Aldous Whitmore, 54, silver-haired, the kind of man who shook your hand and looked slightly past your shoulder. I'd met him twice at company events. Both times he'd been perfectly pleasant in the way that men who have already decided you're unimportant are pleasant. I should have paid more attention to that. The morning everything started to crack open was unremarkable. It was a Thursday in March. I was in my office by 6, coffee going cold on the desk, running a diagnostic on a new compression module I'd been developing for close to 8 months. This wasn't a small thing. It was the architecture for what I believed would be the next generation of real-time data routing for edge networks. I'd filed a provisional patent the previous fall. I had documentation going back 4 years. Susan left for work around 8. She kissed me on the cheek the way people kiss door frames when they walk past. Habit, not intention. What I didn't know was that 3 miles away, in a glass-walled conference room on the 14th floor of Tech Solutions, my work was being shown to a room full of investors. I found out 6 weeks later. A former colleague of mine, a man named Bernard, who I'd known for years from a professional network we both participated in, called me on a Tuesday afternoon. He'd been at an industry symposium. He'd seen a presentation. He wanted to know if I'd recently licensed my compression routing system to anyone. I told him no. I hadn't licensed anything to anyone. I hadn't even finished the final build. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Leonard, I watched a 40-minute presentation yesterday from Tech Solutions. The architecture they showed, the logic structure, the data partitioning method, the dynamic rerouting protocol, it's yours. It's exactly yours. I've seen your preliminary work. This isn't similar. This is your work." I sat with that for a long time after I hung up the phone. I didn't confront Susan that night. I didn't say anything. I went down to my office. I pulled up every document, every version log, every time-stamped build file I had, and I started building a file. Quietly, methodically, the way I'd always worked. I needed to know how far it went before I said a word. I have a habit of keeping meticulous records. Dates, version notes, code comments with timestamps. I backed everything up to an offsite server I managed myself years ago. Partly out of paranoia, partly because I'd once lost 3 weeks of work to a hard drive failure, and I never wanted to feel that again. What I found when I started going through my files was something I hadn't noticed at the time. There were 3 instances over the previous year where folders have been accessed from an unfamiliar IP address through a shared network drive I'd set up for personal backup. I'd given Susan access to that drive years ago so she could retrieve family photos when I wasn't home. She had used it for something else. The access logs showed 3 sessions, each about 40 minutes long, spread across a period of 8 months. The last one was the same week I'd filed my provisional patent. I didn't sleep much that week. I called Bernard back. He put me in touch with a colleague of his who worked in IP litigation. Her name was Priscilla. She was sharp, no nonsense, and when I laid out what I had, she told me to stop touching anything and let her take a look. Within 2 weeks, Priscilla confirmed what I already knew in my gut. The compression module Tech Solutions had presented to investors, the one now at the center of a funding round that could value the company at close to $40 million, was built substantially on my architecture. My filing predated their development timeline by over a year. My documentation was extensive. Her assessment was that I had a strong case. I thanked her, asked her to hold on filing anything just yet, and went home to make dinner. I needed to know one more thing first. I needed to know if my children knew. Garrett had been at Vontech for 14 months. He'd gotten the job 6 weeks after that first unauthorized access to my drive. He'd told me he'd applied through a recruiter. Maybe he had. But the timing sat in my stomach like a stone. Meredith had invested $25,000 of her own savings, money I'd helped her build over the years, into Vontech's internal employee opportunity round 3 months ago. She'd told me it was a good opportunity. She'd been excited. I told her I was glad she was investing. I had known she was investing in a company that was running on stolen work, but I needed to know if she had. I didn't accuse. I didn't toot my hand. I had dinner with both of them the following Sunday. The four of us at the table like always. I watched Susan. She was relaxed. That was the thing that settled into my chest and didn't leave. She was completely relaxed. I watched my son talk about a project at work, enthusiastic, leaning forward the way he used to when he was 9 and explaining something he'd learned in school. I watched my daughter describe a client presentation she was proud of. I thought, maybe they don't know. Maybe this is all Susan and Aldous, and I'm sitting at a table with my family and everything is about to explode and they're innocent. I needed to believe that. Priscilla filed the initial notice 2 weeks later. Vontech Solutions received a formal demand letter. I had instructed her to send it to the company's legal team, not to Susan directly, and not to name her at this stage. Susan found out that same afternoon. She came home and found me in my office, and she stood in the doorway and said, "I assume this is you." I turned around. I looked at her for a long moment. "Did you take my work?" I said. She didn't answer right away. She crossed her arms and said, "You weren't doing anything with it." Those 5 words. I've turned them over in my mind more times than I can count since then. You weren't doing anything with it. As if my work were a lawn I hadn't mowed. As if intellectual property were a borrowed item left too long in the garage. "I had a provisional patent filing," I said. "That's not a patent." "Susan, Aldous needed a solution. I'd been watching you build it for 3 years. You weren't going to take it to market. You never do. You build things and they sit there." I said, "That was my decision to make." She said, "We needed this, Leonard. Garrett needed this. Do you know how hard it is for him out there?" And there it was. I sat with it. The shape of it. She hadn't done this for herself. Or not only for herself. She'd done it for Garrett. She'd gotten our son a position at a company she'd helped build, on a foundation she'd stolen from me. I asked her point blank, "Does Meredith know?" She said no. She looked me in the eye and said Meredith didn't know anything about where the technology came from. I believed her on that. I still do. I asked her about all this. She said he had been the one who first asked her about my work, that he'd known for years, from things she'd mentioned in passing, that I was developing something relevant, that he'd approached her about it 18 months ago, that she'd said no at first. I asked her what changed. She didn't answer. I didn't push. The days that followed were quiet in a way that felt pressurized, like the air before a storm that doesn't know yet which direction to go. Susan and I slept in the same bed. We had coffee in the morning. We said very little. She was talking to Vontech's legal team. I was talking to Priscilla. We were, without discussing it, at war. Then Garrett called me. He called on a Wednesday evening and he led with, "Dad, I need you to think about what you're doing." I said, "I'm pursuing my legal rights to my own work." He said, "You're going to destroy the company I work for." I said, "I didn't build anything for that company." He got louder. He said I was being selfish. He said I'd always been more interested in my projects than in my family. He said that he'd worked hard for where he was, and I was about to take it away because of a technicality. He used the word technicality. He used the word technicality. For a moment, I genuinely couldn't speak. I said very quietly, "Your mother stole my work, Garrett." He said, "She did what she had to do." I hung up. Meredith called 2 hours later. Her tone was different, more careful, more measured. She'd heard from Garrett. She said she hadn't known about the origin of the technology, and I believed her. But then she said something that broke something else in me. She said, "Dad, I have $25,000 in this company. I borrowed against my future to invest. If you do this, I lose everything I put in." I said, "You knew I did technical work." She said, "I didn't know the details." I said, "If someone had stolen your work, what would you want me to do?" She said, I'd want you to be reasonable. Reasonable. My daughter, who I'd helped through college, through her MBA, through every difficult thing, was asking me to be reasonable about someone stealing my life's work because she had put money into the company that stole it. I sat in my office for a long time that night. The whiteboard behind my desk still had notes from the compression module build. I looked at it for a while. I thought about who I was to my family. I thought about what the word passive actually meant, whether it meant calm or whether it meant absent, whether I had been so focused on the work that I'd let the people around me fill in whatever story they wanted about me, and whether that was partly my fault. I turned that over honestly. I'd been distant sometimes. I knew that. I'd missed things, parent-teacher conferences, a few anniversaries, a birthday dinner, once that I still felt bad about. But I had also built a life. I had paid for everything. I had shown up when it truly mattered. And I had never, not once, taken something that wasn't mine. The following week, Priscilla received a counteroffer from Vantech's legal team. Aldis, through his attorneys, proposed a retroactive licensing arrangement. They would pay a one-time fee and retain rights to the technology going forward. The number they offered was low. Insultingly low. Less than 3% of the funding round they were about to close. Priscilla called me after she read it and simply said, "Your response?" I said, "No." She said, "They'll come back higher." I said, "Tell them I'm not interested in licensing." She paused. "What are you interested in?" I said, "Tell them I want full attribution, a royalty structure on all commercial applications of the technology, removal of their existing patent filings which were filed fraudulently, and a public statement of origination." She said that was aggressive. I said I knew. The next move came not from Vantech's lawyers, but from Garrett. He came to the house on a Saturday morning. Susan was there. I don't know if she'd called him or if he'd come on his own, but he sat across from me at the kitchen table with his jaw set and told me that if I continued with the legal action, he would have no choice but to provide testimony to Vantech's legal team about my work habits, my documentation practices, about things he'd overheard and observed growing up in our home, that he felt contradicted my version of events. I looked at my son for a long moment, 26 years old, sitting in the kitchen I paid for, in a house I built a life in, telling me he would testify against me to protect the company that had stolen my work. I said, "Garrett, do you understand what you're saying?" He said he was protecting his livelihood. I said, "I think you should leave." He left. Susan watched from the doorway. She didn't say anything. That night she came to my office. She sat in a chair across from my desk, the one that had always been there for when I wanted company while I worked, which wasn't often enough, I know. And she said, "This is going to destroy this family." I said, "The family was already damaged. I just didn't know it yet." She said she was sorry. She said it quietly and she meant it, I think. Or she meant something. Some version of sorry that included, but was not limited to, regret about the specific action of taking my work. Maybe she was sorry it had come to this. Maybe she was sorry she'd gotten caught. I don't know how to separate those things, and I've stopped trying. I said, "Susan, you had access to my entire life's work. You used it to benefit someone else without asking me, without telling me, and without any apparent belief that it was wrong." She said, "I thought I was helping us." I said, "You helped Aldis Whitmore." She didn't answer that. Priscilla filed the full lawsuit 2 weeks later. The complaint was detailed and well documented. Within 48 hours of the filing becoming public record, I received a call from a journalist at a technology trade publication who had found the case through court filings and wanted to ask me questions. I declined to comment publicly. I decided I wasn't going to fight this in the press. The documents would speak for themselves. What I didn't anticipate was how quickly the story would travel anyway. 3 days after the filing, Vantech's funding round stalled. Their lead investor, a firm based in Austin, had sent a due diligence team back in to review the IP ownership chain after seeing the lawsuit. 2 board members of Vantech, people I'd never met, were now very interested in speaking with Priscilla. Aldis's position within his own company began to shift. I didn't take pleasure in watching that exactly. I felt something more complicated. Something that wasn't satisfaction, but also wasn't grief. Meredith called me 3 times that week. The first 2 calls I let go to voicemail. The 3rd time I picked up, she was crying. She said she was sorry she'd said what she said about being reasonable. She said she hadn't known the full story, that Garrett had only told her part of it, that when she'd looked into it herself, she'd found records, her own bank statements, the dates of her investment, and realized that her mother had encouraged her to invest in Vantech 4 months after accessing my drive. She hadn't put that together before. She asked me what she should do. I said, "Nothing. Let Priscilla handle it." She said, "Are you going to be okay?" That question. From my daughter. It hit me somewhere I wasn't expecting. I said, "I'll be fine." "Are you?" She said she didn't know yet. That was the most honest thing anyone in my family had said to me in months. The resolution came 9 weeks after the lawsuit filing, and it came faster than Priscilla had predicted, which she told me was because Vantech's board was not willing to let this get to trial. The terms we reached were these. Vantech Solutions would remove their fraudulent patent filings. They would enter into a legitimate royalty agreement at a rate Priscilla had negotiated, which was more than fair. They would include a formal statement in their investor documentation, crediting the origination of the core architecture to me. Aldous Whitmore resigned as CEO as part of a separate internal process. I don't know the full details of that, and I didn't ask. Susan resigned from Vantech the day after the settlement was signed. She didn't have to, legally. She chose to. I don't know exactly why. The morning after the settlement, I sat in my office before dawn the way I always do. Coffee, monitors, the quiet that I built a life inside. I looked at the whiteboard. I thought about the 8 months I'd spent on the compression module, about the problem I'd been trying to solve, and about the fact that the solution actually worked, that it was now legally, formally, documentably mine, and that people would use it and it would function, and it had come from this room, and from my brain, and from years of sitting with a problem that most people didn't think was interesting. I thought about my wife sleeping down the hall. We were still under the same roof. I hadn't made any decisions about that yet, and she hadn't either. That chapter wasn't finished. I didn't know what it would become. I thought about Garrett. He hadn't called since that Saturday morning in the kitchen. I didn't know when that would change or if it would. Dad's silence was its own kind of grief. I had held it every day since. I still held it. I thought about the boy who used to sit in my office on weekend afternoons and watch me work and ask me what all the numbers meant. And I thought about the man who had sat across from me and threatened to testify against me. And I couldn't fully connect those two people. Maybe that was a failure of my imagination. Maybe it was a failure of mine as a father. I didn't know. I intended to find out, if he'd let me. Meredith had come over twice since the settlement. We'd had dinner, just the two of us. It was quiet and a little uncertain, the way things are when something has shifted that can't fully shift back. But she was there. She kept showing up. That mattered. I opened a new document and started writing notes on the next project. A different problem. Something I'd been circling for a while. The work was still there. It had always been there. That part, at least, no one could take from me. My wife used to say I was invisible. I think what she meant was that she had stopped looking. I used to think that being quiet meant I was being patient, that if I kept my head down and built something real, the truth of it would eventually speak for itself. And maybe that's still true, but I learned something harder along the way. That silence, when it goes on too long, doesn't just protect you. It also gives other people room to write the story for you. Susan didn't see me as passive because I was weak. She saw me that way because I had never pushed back against that version of me. Every time she answered for me at a dinner table, every time she waved off my work with that dismissive little gesture, I let it pass. I told myself it didn't matter, that the work was what mattered, but actions have weight, whether we acknowledge them or not. And all those small moments of letting it go accumulated into something she genuinely believed, that my work was hers to decide the fate of. That's the part I've sat with the longest, not the betrayal itself, but how much of the ground I gave away before she ever took a step on it. And Garrett, my son. I don't say his name with bitterness, even now, but I think about the version of him that sat in my office as a boy, watching me work, and I wonder where that curiosity went. At some point, he had decided that survival meant protecting the structure that benefited him, even if that structure was built on something wrong. That's a choice people make, often quietly, often without realizing it's a choice at all. He traded his integrity for security and called it loyalty. I hope he figures out, someday, that those two things are not the same. Meredith chose differently. She came back. That matters more than I can say cleanly. She didn't owe me a thing by the time she showed up at my door, and she came anyway. She sat across from me and didn't pretend things were fine, and that kind of honesty, the kind that costs something, is worth more than 100 comfortable dinners. What I know now is this. The work I built was real, because I built it carefully, honestly, and over a long time. No one could manufacture the documentation I had. No one could fake the version logs, the timestamps, the years of iteration. The truth of what I'd created was embedded in the record of how I'd created it. And when it mattered, that record held. That's not luck. That's a way of living. You do the work right. You keep honest records. You don't cut corners even when no one is watching. Because eventually, someone will need to verify who you are, and the only thing that will speak for you is what you actually did. I think about Aldous Whitmore sometimes, a man who built a career on the intelligence of others, who looked at something my wife had described at a dinner table and immediately calculated how to take it. He got further than he deserved for longer than he should have, but the architecture of what he built was borrowed, and borrowed foundations don't hold under real weight. They never do. I'm still in my office before dawn most mornings. The whiteboard behind my desk has new notes on it. Different problem, different diagram. The coffee goes cold the same way it always has. The work continues. It's the most honest thing I know how to say.